Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Flight of Disrespect. Hugh Ellison boarded the sleek, silver aircraft with the same reserved composure that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. As the CEO of Elevate Tech Enterprises, a leading innovator in sustainable technology, Hugh's life was a whirlwind of meetings, conferences, and keynote addresses. Despite his towering stature and commanding presence, Hugh was known for his humility, a quality that belied his monumental accomplishments. Today, he was en route to an international summit in Geneva, where he would unveil a groundbreaking initiative designed to bridge technological gaps in underserved regions. Settling into his first-class seat, he felt a rare moment of peace. The hum of the engines, the soft leather of the seat, and the comforting heft of his favorite book, Rising Above, Leadership Through Adversity, in his lap were all soothing reminders of how far he had come. As the plane began to ascend, Hugh opened his book, the pages worn from frequent reading. It was a guiding text that had inspired him during his toughest moments. His reading was interrupted by the sound of a cart being wheeled down the aisle. "Drink service," came a clipped voice, punctuating the tranquil cabin air. Hugh looked up to see a blonde flight attendant, her name tag reading Angela Moore, standing beside him. Her blue uniform was impeccably pressed, and her expression was as stiff as her posture. "Just water, please," Hugh said with a polite smile. Angela paused, her eyes narrowing as they flicked over him. "Water? How very modest," she remarked, her tone steeped in condescension. Her gaze fell to the book in his hand. "Leadership in Adversity," she read aloud, with a slight sneer. An interesting choice for some. Hugh maintained his composure, though her tone hinted at something he had encountered many times before, thinly veiled doubt about his place in spaces like this. "It's a timeless read," he replied. "It's helped me navigate some complex challenges." Angela raised an eyebrow, her skepticism barely masked. "Complex challenges, huh? And what is it that you do exactly?" "I'm the CEO of Elevate Tech Enterprises," Hugh answered calmly, though he felt the familiar sting of having to justify himself. "CEO, really?" Angela let out a sharp laugh that seemed to slice through the cabin's hush. "You must have had some interesting opportunities to land a seat here." Hugh's grip on his book tightened. Around him, passengers began to shift uncomfortably. A man across the aisle glanced up from his tablet, frowning slightly. Hugh cleared his throat. "I've worked hard to get where I am, just like anyone else here." Angela leaned closer, her smile cold and cutting. "Oh, I'm sure you have. But these seats are quite exclusive. Maybe next time, Coach might feel a bit more fitting." The cabin grew heavy with tension. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around, her face etched with shock, but quickly looked away when Angela shot her a glare. Hugh felt the weight of every stare in the cabin. Some passengers looked at him with sympathy, others with a vague discomfort as though they wished they were anywhere but here. Hugh inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm. "Is there anything else I can help you with, ma'am?" he asked evenly. Angela straightened her uniform with a self-satisfied smirk. "Just remember," she said, her voice honeyed but biting, "not everything in life can be bought. Some things take real class." With that, she pushed her cart forward, leaving Hugh to the whispers and side glances of the cabin. Hugh stared at his book, the words swimming on the page. He polished his glasses, a ritual that helped him collect his thoughts, and returned them to the bridge of his nose. He could feel the sting of the encounter settling in his chest, the familiar ache of having to defend his worth in spaces where his presence was questioned. But Hugh had long since learned to channel those moments of indignation into fuel for his success. He reopened his book, determined to focus on the chapters that had guided him through worse storms than this. The flight attendant returned some minutes later with snack service. Angela's voice carried through the cabin, loud enough to draw attention. "Our premium snacks are available," she announced, her eyes flicking to Hugh. "Though I'd be happy to fetch something simpler if that's more your speed." Hugh looked up at her, his face impassive. "I'm fine, thank you," he said, his voice calm despite the simmering frustration beneath. Angela lingered beside his seat, her eyes scanning his tailored navy suit and polished shoes. Quite an expensive look, she remarked, her tone sharper now. Must have cost a fortune. She paused dramatically. You know, some people save money on frivolities like this and use it for practical things. Have you ever considered that? Before Hugh could reply, a woman's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Excuse me, said Sarah, a young teacher sitting behind Hugh. Her voice was steady, her eyes blazing with indignation. What you're doing is completely uncalled for. This man has done nothing to deserve your behavior. Angela turned slowly, her smile sharpening into something predatory. Ma'am, she began, I suggest you focus on your own journey. I'd hate to have to report a disruptive passenger. The veiled threat hung in the air, silencing Sarah for the moment, though her defiance was clear in her tight grip on the armrests. Hugh watched the exchange, a flicker of admiration for Sarah's courage lighting in his chest. Around them, the cabin buzzed with murmurs, passengers glancing between Hugh, Sarah, and Angela. Some looked uneasy, others sympathetic. Hugh took a deep breath. He had spent years enduring prejudice, navigating these treacherous waters with dignity and grace. Yet this time felt different. As Angela's steps retreated, Hugh's mind began to turn. He would not escalate the situation, but he would not let this moment pass without consequence. Angela Moore might think she held the power in this cabin, but she had no idea who she was dealing with, or how far Hugh's quiet strength could reach. The unveiling of truth. Hugh remained in his seat, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. He had spent years mastering the art of restraint, turning moments of adversity into opportunities to rise above. But Angela Moore's audacity was not just unprofessional, it was personal. Her words carried the weight of years of prejudice, a shadow Hugh had battled since the day he decided to carve his path in a world that often underestimated men like him. As the flight continued, Hugh glanced around the cabin. Most of the passengers avoided eye contact, their discomfort evident. The few brave enough to meet his gaze offered apologetic nods, but no one else had spoken up since Sarah's bold interjection. Hugh couldn't blame them. Silence was often easier, even when injustice was screaming for attention. Angela's voice echoed from the galley, her cheerful tone grating against the tension she had created. Hugh closed his book, his mind no longer able to focus on the familiar words. Instead, he began mentally piecing together the events of the last 30 minutes, considering his next move. An unexpected advocate. The soft chime of the cabin's PA system broke his thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 35,000 feet and expect a smooth ride for the remainder of the flight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey. The announcement seemed to ease some of the unease in the cabin, but not for long. From her seat behind Hugh, Sarah McKinley had been silently observing Angela's behavior. A third-grade teacher from Chicago, Sarah wasn't one to tolerate bullying, no matter the setting. She had always taught her students to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Sarah leaned forward again, her voice steady but firm. Mr. Damon, may I say something? Hugh turned slightly, nodding. Of course. You don't have to sit there and take this, Sarah said, her green eyes blazing with determination. People like her only get away with this, because no one holds them accountable. Her words resonated with Hugh, stirring something deep within him. He nodded again, his gratitude evident. Thank you for speaking up earlier, he said. It means more than you know. Before Sarah could respond, Angela reappeared, pushing the drink cart with renewed determination. Her forced smile returned as she moved through the rows, but when her eyes landed on Hugh, her mask faltered. I hope you're enjoying the flight, Angela said, her voice clipped. Let me know if there's anything, within reason, that you need. Hugh looked up, his expression calm but unwavering. Thank you, he said simply, refusing to engage further. Angela moved on, her frustration evident in her hurried steps. The shift in dynamics. As the hours passed, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. Passengers returned to their books, laptops, and in-flight entertainment, but the air remained heavy. Hugh noticed the whispers, the sidelong glances, and the subtle shifts in body language that spoke of silent support. Then, something unexpected happened. A man seated a few rows back, a middle-aged professional with salt and pepper hair and a tech conference badge clipped to his laptop bag, stood up and approached Hugh's seat. His expression was one of recognition and admiration. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice cutting through the cabin. "Are you Hugh Ellison?" Hugh nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Yes, I am." The man extended his hand enthusiastically. "I thought so. I saw your keynote at the Global Sustainability Summit last year. Your work on renewable energy platforms is revolutionary. It's an honor to meet you." Hugh shook his hand, his modesty intact despite the growing attention. "Thank you. I'm glad to know the work is making an impact." The exchange caught the attention of several passengers. Phones appeared as people began to Google Hugh's name. Murmurs spread through the cabin as articles and accolades about Hugh's career surfaced. A younger passenger, dressed in casual business attire, leaned over to show his travel companion a video of Hugh accepting an award for his philanthropic efforts. "He's a big deal," the man whispered. Angela, who had been hovering near the galley, froze in place. Her earlier confidence dissolved as the realization of who she had been targeting began to dawn on her. The turning point. The cabin buzzed with a new energy. Passengers who had remained passive now shifted their focus, many offering Hugh nods of respect. Sarah couldn't suppress a small, satisfied smile as Angela's composure visibly cracked. Hugh, sensing the shift in dynamics, decided it was time to act, not out of anger, but to make this moment a teachable one. He pressed the call button. Angela hesitated before approaching, her smile faltering. "Yes, Mr. Ellison," she asked, her voice quieter than before. Hugh looked her directly in the eyes, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'd like to speak with the purser," he said. Angela blinked, her face flushing. "The purser? May I ask why?" "I believe it's necessary," Hugh replied evenly. "There are some matters I'd like to address regarding this flight." The passengers watched in silence as Angela retreated to fetch the purser, a middle-aged man named David Carlyle who had been overseeing the cabin from the shadows. David approached with a professional yet concerned expression. "Mr. Ellison, I'm David Carlyle, the purser on this flight. Is there something I can assist you with?" "Yes," Hugh said, his voice steady but resolute. "I'd like to discuss the treatment I've received during this flight. It's important that situations like this are addressed constructively, for the sake of your airline and its passengers." David's brow furrowed as he listened. "I assure you, Mr. Ellison, this will be taken seriously. May I ask for specific details?" Hugh recounted the events calmly and factually, ensuring his words were free of malice. As he spoke, the weight of the cabin's collective attention pressed on Angela, who stood frozen a few rows away. David nodded gravely. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, sir. On behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for any distress this may have caused. I assure you, we will address this appropriately. The lesson begins." As David walked away to debrief Angela, Hugh leaned back in his seat. He hadn't sought revenge, but he knew the message had been delivered. Sarah leaned forward again, her voice soft. "You handled that with so much grace. I don't know if I could have done the same." Hugh smiled faintly. Sometimes the best way to respond to adversity is to let the truth speak for itself. The remainder of the flight passed without incident, but the impact of the events lingered in the cabin. Angela, once so confident, now moved with hesitation, her earlier bravado replaced by quiet reflection. Hugh reopened his book, the words on the page resonating more deeply than ever. "Adversity reveals character, grace transforms it." The storm before the calm. As the flight continued its steady progress through the skies, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The tension that had hung in the air like an unwelcome storm cloud now seemed to dissipate, replaced by an uncomfortable, almost palpable silence. The passengers, who had witnessed the exchange between Hugh and the flight attendant, Emma, had all returned to their personal worlds, some back to their books, others to their screens, but there was an undercurrent of unease, a murmur of recognition that something had changed, something had broken through. Hugh sat back in his seat, his hands folded neatly on his lap. He could hear the soft hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of a passenger's magazine, but his mind was far from idle. He had encountered discrimination before, in subtle and not-so-subtle forms. As a black man who had risen to prominence in the corporate world, he was no stranger to condescension and prejudice. But this incident, this petty encounter with a flight attendant who seemed determined to degrade him in front of others, had stirred something deep within him. Something that had been simmering for years, but never truly unleashed. The years of building tech vision solutions from the ground up, navigating boardrooms, raising capital, forging partnerships, and leading his team with a steady hand, he had earned his place in the world. But as a black CEO in a predominantly white industry, there were always those moments, those looks, those words, that reminded him that not everyone saw him for what he had achieved. It was as though every success had a footnote: he's only here because of this or that. Or worse, he doesn't belong here. But that was the thing about Hugh, he never let them define him. He had learned long ago that success was not just about the titles or the accolades, but about how you carried yourself in the face of adversity. And this flight, was another test. The weight of the past. It wasn't long before the purser, David Carlyle, returned to Hugh's seat. He was a man of few words, but his expression conveyed sincerity. His eyes met Hugh's, and for the briefest of moments, there was an understanding between them. David had heard the whole story from Emma's side, and now he was here to listen to Hugh's. The apology had been made, but there was more to this than a simple mistake or misunderstanding. "Mr. Damon, I just wanted to assure you that we are taking this situation seriously," David began, his voice respectful but firm. "We'll be following up with our customer service team once we land, and we'll address this with the appropriate channels. You'll hear from us, and we will make sure this is resolved." Hugh nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He had heard those words before. Promises. Assurances. It was always the same: "We'll fix it," but it often didn't go beyond the surface. He appreciated the gesture, but he knew that true change was more complicated than a few well-meaning apologies. "Thank you, David," Hugh said quietly, his gaze focused on the window. "But this isn't just about me. It's about how people are treated. It's about how we, as a society, perpetuate these behaviors without even realizing it. Emma didn't just make a mistake, she exposed something that's all too common. The way she spoke to me, the way she assumed, it's bigger than this flight." David's expression softened. He had been in the airline industry long enough to know that the dynamics between employees and passengers could be complex. But he also knew that Hugh's words weren't just about an isolated incident, they were a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue that stretched far beyond this plane. "I'll make sure it's addressed," David said earnestly. "But you're right. There's more to this than just one flight attendant. The kind of behavior Emma displayed is unacceptable, and we can't let it slide." Hugh smiled faintly. "I appreciate that. It's not about punishing her, it's about understanding why this happens. Why people still think it's okay to treat others like this. I've been through this my whole career. And every time I think things are changing, something like this happens." David, sensing the weight of Hugh's words, nodded. "It's not easy, sir. But sometimes the only way forward is by calling these things out. It's why we have to address it properly, not just sweep it under the rug." Hugh leaned back, his eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. The plane was now nearing its final destination, and the last few hours of the flight would offer him time to reflect, to plan the next steps. This moment, this experience, had given him more than just the opportunity for revenge. It had reminded him of why he had started Tech Vision Solutions in the first place. The goal had never been about fame or fortune. It had always been about creating something that could empower others, change lives, and challenge the status quo. The ripple effect. As the plane began its descent, the cabin slowly came to life again. The buzz of passengers returning to their routines filled the air, but Hugh remained in quiet contemplation. He had never been one for dramatic gestures, for seeking out public spectacles. But this moment had felt different. The sharp sting of Emma's words had opened something inside him, something he hadn't realized he had been suppressing all these years. And now, as the plane circled toward its final approach, Hugh knew that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. It wasn't just about the apology that would be sent his way once the flight landed. It was about something bigger, the continued fight for respect and equality. He had built his career not by accepting the limits others had tried to impose on him, but by pushing back against them, finding ways to break through barriers and pave the way for others to follow. But there was more work to be done. "Mr. Damon?" Hugh looked up to see Sarah McKinley standing in the aisle, her small suitcase in hand. She had a quiet, determined air about her, a look that suggested she wasn't finished. "I just wanted to thank you for handling everything the way you did," she said earnestly. "It's rare to see someone handle this kind of situation with such dignity. A lot of people would have fought back, but you, well, you showed all of us that it's about keeping your composure. I admire that." Hugh offered her a warm smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. But I think you deserve just as much credit. You were the first one to stand up." "That's not easy." Sarah shook her head. "It wasn't much. But I felt like I had to say something. I know we don't know each other, but I think you could make a big difference. I think the world needs people like you, people who stand up, even when it's uncomfortable." Hugh's heart warmed at her words. It had been a long time since anyone had said something like that to him, and it reminded him that there were others who believed in change, in fighting for what was right, even when it was hard. "We all have a part to play," Hugh said, his voice thoughtful. "And sometimes, all it takes is one person to speak up to spark something bigger. Maybe this is just one small moment, but maybe it's part of a bigger shift." As Sarah smiled and made her way down the aisle, Hugh felt a sense of hope rising within him. Yes, the world was full of challenges, of injustice, of prejudice, but it was also full of people who cared, people who were willing to make a difference. And sometimes, all it took was one small spark to light the way. As the plane landed, Hugh Damon's mind was already working ahead, thinking of the steps he would take to turn this experience into something transformative. The ripples from this moment, from Emma's behavior and the quiet resistance of passengers like Sarah, had already begun to spread, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The reckoning and the resolve. The plane touched down gently, its wheels kissing the runway with a satisfying hum. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, passengers slowly began to stir from their reverie. Some gathered their belongings, others anxiously checked their phones, but for Hugh Damon, the journey had just begun. The final destination wasn't merely a physical one, it was a moment of reflection and action. He stood up, gathering his things in a slow, deliberate manner, taking one last look around the cabin before stepping into the aisle. In a way, the confrontation with Emma, the flight attendant, had been a catalyst for something larger, a moment that forced him to confront not just the biases of others, but the latent anger he'd kept buried for years. He had built his career through determination and grace, fighting battles quietly behind closed doors, but this had been different. It was a public affront, a challenge that reached beyond the usual microaggressions and corporate maneuvering. And it had changed something in him. It wasn't the public apology that mattered most. It wasn't the recognition of who he was or what he had accomplished. It was the quiet realization that he had the power to drive real change, to make sure this moment wasn't forgotten, and to use it as a platform to elevate the voices of those who had long been silenced or marginalized. The power of his response, his choice to remain composed yet resolute, had already sparked something within him, something that demanded more than passive endurance. He needed to use this experience to fuel his broader mission, one that went beyond corporate profits and business partnerships. The first call. As Hugh walked off the plane, his mind was already racing with ideas, with plans. The terminal was bustling, but all he could hear in his head was the ringing of his phone. He quickly retrieved his device from his coat pocket and noticed several missed calls and messages, some from colleagues, others from friends and acquaintances. But there was one message that stood out. It was from his assistant, Karen. "Mr. Damon, I've just heard the news. Everyone here at Tech Vision Solutions is rallying behind you. I think it's time to make an official statement. This could be bigger than just a PR opportunity, it's a chance to truly stand up for what we believe in." Hugh paused for a moment, processing the weight of Karen's words. She was right. This wasn't just about addressing an isolated incident, it was an opportunity to raise awareness about the systemic issues in society, about the bias that Black professionals, particularly in leadership roles, often faced. He immediately tapped out a quick response: "Let's make it happen. Set up a press conference for tomorrow. Make sure it's clear that this is not just about one incident, it's about creating change, about advocating for respect and equality in every industry." He took a deep breath, slipping his phone back into his pocket as he walked through the terminal. His decision was made. He would not let this moment pass without using it as a springboard for something larger. The world, it seemed, was ready for change, and Hugh Damon was prepared to be a part of it. A public statement. The next day, the press conference was held at Tech Vision Solutions headquarters. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing as Hugh took his seat at the head of the table. His face was calm, yet there was a resoluteness in his posture, a quiet strength that demanded attention. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and firm. "Today, I stand before you not as a CEO, but as a person who has faced challenges that so many others continue to face every day. This isn't just about one flight attendant or one incident, this is about a system that continues to marginalize people based on their race, their background, and their identity." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The silence was palpable, every eye in the room fixed on him. "I've spent my career fighting against this kind of bias, but what happened on that flight made me realize something: this fight is far from over. We cannot just sit back and accept these injustices. We must call them out and demand accountability, not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of society." Hugh continued, his eyes never wavering. "In the wake of this incident, I've had the opportunity to reflect on how we, as a company, can do better. And I promise you that we will lead by example. Tech Vision Solutions will now launch a new initiative aimed at combating discrimination and bias in tech. We will work with organizations that promote diversity and inclusivity, and we will ensure that our hiring practices reflect the values we hold dear: equality, respect, and opportunity for all." He looked directly into the camera now, his voice unwavering. "But it doesn't stop there. I'm committing to the creation of scholarships and mentorship programs for underrepresented groups in tech. It's time we stop waiting for change to come to us. We need to be the ones driving it." The room erupted into applause. The journalists exchanged looks, clearly impressed by his words, but Hugh knew that his actions would speak louder than any statement. This wasn't just about addressing one wrong, it was about laying the groundwork for a future where incidents like the one he'd endured would be less likely to happen, where people would be judged by their character, not the color of their skin or the position they held. A new beginning. The months that followed the press conference were filled with tangible changes. Tech Vision Solutions became a beacon for diversity and inclusion within the tech industry. The new programs Hugh had promised were implemented quickly, and soon, he was collaborating with other CEOs to push for a wider corporate culture shift. But the true transformation was in the subtle ways society began to change its approach to race, leadership, and opportunity. Hugh's own journey was also changing. He had taken Emma's insult, her ignorance, and turned it into a mission, a driving force that fueled his work every day. He no longer saw the challenges he faced as isolated obstacles, they were part of a much larger picture, a broader movement that he had become an integral part of. The power of resilience, of refusing to be diminished by the actions of others, had carried him far. And now, he was using that power to uplift others who had been marginalized for too long. Emma Moore, the flight attendant, was not forgotten in all of this. After the incident, she had been suspended pending an investigation, and Hugh had made it clear that he would not participate in any punitive measures. Instead, he had suggested a program for flight attendants focused on sensitivity training, education about bias, and understanding the impact of their words. Emma herself had reluctantly agreed to participate. She had reached out to Hugh privately to express her regret, not just for her actions, but for the ignorance that had guided her behavior. In many ways, she was just as much a victim of a biased system as the people she had demeaned. Hugh's forgiveness, however, did not come easily. It was a long process, one that required both of them to acknowledge their parts in the incident. But through it, Hugh learned that true strength lay not in holding on to bitterness, but in using his experiences to transform those around him. The legacy of change. Years later, when Hugh Damon looked back on that flight, it was no longer just an isolated event in his career. It had become a turning point, the moment when he fully understood the depth of the impact he could have, not just as a leader in the tech world, but as a catalyst for social change. The world had begun to change. More Black CEOs rose to prominence, more diverse voices filled the boardrooms, and the workplace became a reflection of the inclusive society people like Hugh had worked so tirelessly to create. His efforts had inspired a generation, and his story was no longer just about one man overcoming adversity, it was about an entire movement of individuals, empowered and united in their resolve to change the world. And as for Emma? She too had changed. The past that had shaped her worldview was no longer something she could hide behind. She had found her own path to redemption, not through grand gestures, but through the small, everyday acts of kindness, understanding, and respect she now gave to everyone she encountered. The lesson Hugh Damon carried with him, and the one he left behind for others, was simple. True revenge wasn't in getting even, but in creating something better in the world, a world that, at least in this small corner, was just a little bit more fair, more equal, and more compassionate than it had been before.